Hello, and welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. It's October 18th, 2023. I'm Harley Schlanger, and I will be your host. You can send us your questions and comments at the questions@schillerinstitute.org. That's questions@schillerinstitute.org, or post them in the YouTube chat room, and we'll see if we can get to as many as possible. Now, Helga, your warning last week of the danger that the crisis in Southwest Asia could explode into a rapidly expanding danger of world war seems unfortunately to be coming true. The rocket attack on the Al-Ali Baptist Hospital in Gaza yesterday, which has killed hundreds of people, has been fueling demonstrations in all the states neighboring Israel. There have been comments from many Arab governments and from other governments around the world, the African Union and so on. And yet, the big question remains, will Israel go ahead with a ground invasion? Chancellor Scholz was the first head of state to visit Israel and give his blessing to Netanyahu's war of vengeance, as Netanyahu himself is calling it. And then Joe Biden is there today pledging unconditional support. And yesterday, an effort by Russia to get a resolution through the United Nations calling for a ceasefire was shot down by the United States, just as the U.S. has been shooting down proposals for a diplomatic resolution in Ukraine. So you, Helga, have a lot of experience in this region. You work very closely with your husband, Lyndon LaRouche, who is very knowledgeable and very influential with his writings and presentations on a solution to this crisis. What's your present assessment of where this is, and what's required to stop the escalation from going to a full-scale war?
Well, I think that the simultaneous worsening of the Ukraine crisis and the crisis in the Middle East or Southwest Asia should really be the alarm for anybody that if we don't move to change the dynamic, this may get out of control much more quickly and end up in a world war. And that is why, before I go into any assessments, I want to say that we have to, anybody who wants to have peace and prevent the escalation of this crisis should really join hands with us to put on the table our, three proposals. One is that we absolutely all have to, all movements, all people, all individuals around the world should support the initiative, which I think came originally from China, then was backed up by Brazil, by President Lula, and I think it's now pretty much on the agenda to have an immediate peace conference for Southwest Asia to stop the crisis through negotiations. Then, the economic substance must be put in such a conference, which is what my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, already wrote about in 1975, where he called for a so-called oasis plan for the Middle East, meaning that you have to create lots of new water, new fresh water, make the deserts bloom to create the kind of economic development for all the countries and all the peoples in the region as the absolute necessary precondition for a peace in Southwest Asia. And then thirdly, that the resolution, which was adopted actually several times by the United Nations Security Council, the resolution 242, basically must be implemented. And naturally a two-state resolution. Palestine must have an independent state as part of this process. So there is a solution. I mean, it should also be obvious that Southwest Asia is only part of the world crisis, because it's not just the dynamics in the region itself which works, but it is the larger context of the geopolitical confrontation of the so-called West, the neoliberal financial system, especially under the leadership of the United States, who wants to keep basically a dominant position in the world and has basically reduced Europe into a colony. I mean, it's a tragedy, but that's what it is. Against the emerging new world economic order, around the BRICS Plus, the global South, the global majority, where it would be so easy to solve it, but they decided to keep the confrontation. And that dynamic is the underlying dynamic even in Southwest Asia and naturally in Ukraine. And that is why a peace plan, a peace conference for the Middle East can only be the first stepping stone for a new security and development architecture for the whole world, which must take into account the security interest of everybody, every nation on the planet. And I think that is something I would really like to start the discussion or the thinking process with, because, there are those who demand that you now have to completely, totally, in Germany, for example, take the side of Israel, that is the defense of Israel is the state raison d'etre for Germany. Now, I would like to remind people that one big lesson of the Peace of Westphalia was, after 150 years of religious war and after 4 years of tedious negotiations before it came to a solution, was the recognition that a peace solution always requires that one takes into account the interest of the other. And when you somehow try to create a situation where you say, no, one side is absolutely right, then you preclude a peace. I mean, the difference between the Peace of Westphalia and the Versailles Treaty was that the Peace of Westphalia created the basis for the emergence of international law of the people, while the Versailles Treaty, because it did not take into account the interest of the other, it did not take into account the truth, the historic truth, or the interest of Germany or China, and therefore it had the seed of what would soon become World War II. And if you want to end this, then you have to apply the principle of the interest of the other. So I think, we are sitting on a complete powder keg. I can only say that the situation is super dangerous because the fact that the United States has now sent the long-range missiles, I've forgotten how the name, the MX, no, they are called differently, sorry. ATACMS, I'm sorry, which has been characterized by the Russian side immediately as a very dangerous escalation of the crisis and leading to a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia. Then you have the situation in Southwest Asia, where you were asking about, or you were mentioning the possibility of a ground offensive by the Israelis. Now, that is still obviously a very dangerous possibility, because if that would happen, it would just increase the absolutely unbelievable situation in Gaza to a point of explosion. I'm sure of that. Not in Gaza, because people have very little means. The people have very little means, but it would be a very nasty and long, dragged out confrontation, because Hamas has created tunnels and bunkers, and even if I don't even want to imagine what would happen if that would happen. It would be a nightmare. But I have read certain experts being rather hesitant about that option, because it does require an intensive battle, and it is not so clear if the Israeli armed forces really are prepared at this point to undertake that, because Hamas obviously was able for a very long time to prepare for something like that. They do have a lot of tunnels and very elaborated defense systems. And naturally, that would then leave the flank with Lebanon open. But I'm not saying it will not happen. I'm just saying that there are experts who basically, are basically considering that Israel may not want to do that because the backlash would be tremendous. But on the other side, the option that it may happen is still is absolutely still there, because naturally, that has been in the plans of some people for a long time as well. So I think that we are sitting on an extremely dangerous situation. I think this is I don't even want to think about what is happening to the people who are locked in the Gaza Strip right now. There are reports that 600,000 people fled from the north, but there's no facility, there's no food, no fuel, no water, no medicine. The hospitals are emptied, or in this case now being bombed with 600 people plus dead. Many roads, you cannot drive anymore over it because they're full of rubble from the bombings. The situation at the only place where people before could leave at the border with Egypt is closed. Egypt has apparently made a decision that they do not accept the Palestinian refugees to come to Egypt. So the situation of these people is absolutely, I don't even want to imagine what people are going through in this kind of situation. Now, I think that anybody who is reasonable must really mobilize everything we can to say that a diplomatic solution, a ceasefire, negotiations is the only way out of this situation, and must really mobilize for that. Anything else, anything which encourages either the one side or the other to keep up the fight, I think is threatening that this thing goes completely out of control, leading to a world war. And that would be the end of everything.
Well, Helga, as you mentioned, part of the mobilization is the new leaflet that the Schiller Institute has put out, which is an emergency call under the headline Westphalia, not Versailles. And that's available on the Schiller Institute website. And I would urge people to read it and circulate it, because it gets right to the heart of what you were just discussing. Now, there are a number of questions that have come in about that situation in Southwest Asia, but I want to hopefully have some time to broaden it to other areas. But let me start with comments from two people who are longtime collaborators of ours. One is a very good supporter, but quite demoralized, and asked, isn't it too late to insist on a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine right now? And then a second, more hopeful supporter asked, haven't we learned yet that a violent response just begets more violence? So I wonder if you have comments for those two questions.
On the second question, the answer is obviously yes. As long as you keep answering with revenge, even if it may be understandable and people have all the reasons to say that the suffering became too much, and you had, any continuation of policies which are based on revenge and hatred will breed more of that. And the only way how you can break out of it is you have to drastically apply the principle of the Peace of Westphalia. They came to the conclusion after 150 years of religious war that if they would continue, there would be nobody alive to enjoy the victory. And they came to the conclusion that as a principle of foreign policy, hatred has to be replaced by love. Now, applied to the situation in Southwest Asia, that sounds obviously, very, very far off, but it's nevertheless true. Now, that love doesn't have to be some strange romantic idea what love is. Love in this case would mean to create the economic conditions for the other side to have a decent, fulfilled life. And the poverty in the region is absolutely incredible. So the Oasis plan, which was proposed by Lyndon LaRouche in 1975 already, is still an extremely viable conception, because it basically said that you have to create the infrastructure to have agriculture. You have to green the deserts. In order to green the deserts, you have to produce a lot more fresh water. And how do you do that? You do it by peaceful nuclear energy being the energy source for the desalination of huge amounts of ocean water, with which you can build canals and irrigation of agriculture and so forth. You have aquifers, which are, for the short term accessible. They already used in Israel and other countries in the region ionization of the atmosphere to cause rainfall patterns. All of these things could be applied to completely change the situation and indeed have agricultural development, industrial development, basic infrastructure. Now with the Belt and Road Initiative being potentially extended into the entire Southwest Asia, this was what was the plan after the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That can still be put back on the table. Even the EMEC, the India Middle East Economic Corridor, which was announced recently, and which had a little geopolitical connotation, being against the BRI. It doesn't have to be against the BRI. These infrastructure projects tend to grow into each other once you develop them, and they can be the basis for peace of everybody. So I think that idea that you have to stop the hatred and replace it with love, and love being, to do the good for the other, is the only option. And, wise people on all sides are being called upon to act on that basis. Now, a two-state solution, I know it's very difficult now. It has been attempted to ruin that option by all these settlements, which obviously is a huge problem. But if there is an overall approach, and maybe the Middle East is just the first step, and you need a new global security and development architecture. I mean, if the United States and Russia and China, to start with, would get an agreement, all problems could be solved. The only reason why these regional problems cannot be solved is because, they're proxies for the larger context of the strategic showdown between the US, NATO, Russia, and China. But, there is right now a whole other world emerging with the BRICS and, the 10-year anniversary of the BRI, which is being, celebrated right now in Beijing. That's an incredible success story, despite the meek efforts by the Western media to say, oh, it's such a failure. The 10 years BRI have transformed many countries of the world. They have completely changed the dynamic whereby the global South countries are, for the first time, see the opportunity to overcome underdevelopment. I mean, that spirit can be brought even into Southwest Asia. And, I think that, it's not that everybody in Israel wants to continue on this path of confrontation. Look at around the world. There are many Jewish organizations around the world demonstrating in Washington, elsewhere. So it's not an issue between religions. It's an issue, between basically those people who agree that we must absolutely end the war and overcome geopolitics by a peaceful solution which allows the survival and well-being of everybody.
Well, Helga, I think you convinced one of our questioners who asked, how do we prevent failing into emotional counter-reflex and maintain unity and prevent communities from falling against each other? And then he answers his own question. The Oasis plan seems like one example. Now, here are two questions that are basically the same. One from Facebook, someone asks, Will the Israelis rise up and defeat Netanyahu so he's replaced by someone willing to seek peace with the Palestinians? Someone else wrote, 6 weeks ago, there were hundreds of thousands of Israelis in the street protesting Netanyahu's so-called judicial reforms. Is this crisis deflecting all opposition to him? So what can you say about what's happening in Israel?
Well, I mean, the conflict, which was the subject for a long time and where people were demonstrating against judicial reform, that conflict is not gone. It has been papered over, because of the present crisis and the short-term, in my view, short-term so-called national unity government, which includes, Benny Gantz, it includes some others, but it does not include the major opposition party for once, with Lapid. Then, I think this will not hold very long. And, I think Israelis and Jewish people all over the world, they are right now in a absolute nightmare situation. But I think once reflection sets in, I think that the idea that we absolutely must find a higher level of reason will settle in. And, in that case, I think also Netanyahu's political future may not be one to look forward to, because, he has some very personal reasons why he is doing what he's doing. And, I think that the Israelis will find a way of dealing with that once we have this overall framework to settle the crisis.
Now, Helga, you mentioned the Ukraine situation. We do have a question from someone who asked about the fact that it was reported now by Zelensky that U.S. ATACMS missiles have been delivered to Ukraine, and Zelensky saying this could be a game changer. Biden had previously said he wasn't going to send them, and then he seems to have done it through a back door, through very quietly. This does seem to signal an intent that the U.S. is not giving up, and NATO either, on using the proxy war to severely damage Russia. What would you say to that?
Well, I mean, Biden made this unbelievable remark about, I think it was in 60 Minutes, where he said that, one has to put, quote, Putin down. I mean, for a president of a country to say that about the strongest nuclear power in the world, I mean, I don't want to comment on Biden. People have said already a lot about it. But to say such a thing, it is so beyond the beyond. I mean, Putin answered to that, and he was relatively nonchalant and generous about it, given the enormity of the statement. But, I think, unfortunately, behind all of that is, I really hate to say this, but I think behind all of that is the clear escalation intention to escalate the situation. And that is why I think that, escalate the situation means they don't accept, first of all, the Western elites, they don't even reflect for one single minute that the entire crisis is a reflection of their own policies. And there's zero intention to reflect, maybe they made a mistake. Maybe it was their idea of causing world dominance, unipolar world, expansion of NATO, encirclement of China, building 800 military bases around the world, and on, that would all cause a blowback. And that blowback is right now not to be stopped. I think that the idea to put this whole genie back in the bottle and go back to an unipolar world, I think that's out of the question. I think the idea of winning that confrontation with Russia and China is also out of the question. And I think it was a very clear demonstration that, at the BRI summit, I watched this in the Chinese TV, they had a banquet on the evening before the Belt and Road Forum, and they opened a big door, and out of it came together Xi Jinping and Putin. And it was a clear demonstration that the relationship between the two countries is one of a very profound, deep strategic alliance, and that of the two men is one of a grown political friendship which has developed over many years. So whoever is taking on one, namely Putin in this case, or Russia, has to calculate that it's not just Russia, it's also, the whole new arrangement of countries, which have now become the BRICS Plus. This is the original BRICS countries plus the 6 who are supposed to become members on January 1st, and 40 new countries who want to be part of the BRICS as well. So it is the majority of the world population. And even if it does not sound likely, I still keep saying it's the only way how we can come out of this crisis is that we get forces in Europe and in the United States to say, let's change course. The BRI has been an option open to all from the beginning. There is still the chance, if the United States and European nations would say, we want to cooperate with the BRI to develop Latin America, Asia, and Africa, the door would be open. I'm 100% certain of that. And what would be so problematic about that? I mean, this whole narrative about, the good guys, the democracies against the bad guys, the autocracies, it's just a myth. It's a narrative. A narrative is a fairy tale. It's not the truth. Now, it's becoming almost risky to say what I'm saying here, but this insanity must stop, and we must find an order of all nations where we can live together peacefully. And geopolitics is a mental disease which we must get rid of.
Well, I certainly second you on that one. Now, Helga, we have a couple of questions on the Belt and Road Initiative conference in Beijing. One is more of a comment from Goleng Zheng from Singapore, who said, the Chinese government seems to be following the ideas of the late legend Lyndon LaRouche on economic development and infrastructure with the Belt and Road Initiative. And he wants your comment on that. But the other question is from someone who obviously is trying to find out about it and is frustrated. Just said, how can you have Putin, Xi, and 140 governments participating, and we can't find it in the Western press? Where can we find information about what's going on in Beijing with this conference?
Yeah, that is really amazing. I was also listening to the media here in Germany, and there is one report after the other that, the Belt and Road Initiative is a complete failure, that it just causes a debt trap for the participating countries, and on and on. And, again, nothing is more a lie than that, because the Belt and Road Initiative, which is now 10 years old, is indeed the greatest infrastructure project in history. It has completely changed the dynamic. I mean, if you're blind to that, you're just not willing to face the facts. Through the developing countries in the form of the non-aligned movement have tried to get justice to overcome colonialism for half a century or more. In the beginning, it starting maybe with the Bandung Conference in 1955, which was between Asia and Africa, there was the hope that this could be realized very, very quickly. But then it turned out that the independence fights, where many countries did win independence, it did not really get them real independence, because the conditionalities of the IMF, for example, the lack of access to credit for development, the imposition of conditionalities which would force countries to not invest in healthcare infrastructure in order to pay the debt, the debt trap was long before China even played a significant role, to the IMF, to the World Bank, and many of these countries got entangled into a complete impossible situation. Many of their leaders were assassinated. If a leader of a developing country started to seriously fight for his nation, there were many incidents where people were eliminated. There's a long history of that. But then, obviously what my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, and the people associated with him for half a century were fighting for, it's now happening. But we put out these economic development programs for a very long time, and you can read them all. Go to our archives and you can read up on the history of that. But the reason why these countries of the global south now feel empowered to actually accomplish what we proposed is because of China. Because you have now the second largest economy, which very well may be already the largest one in terms of buying power, in terms of physical economy, in terms of machine tool, in terms of actual physical economy. China is probably the largest economy already. And they have transformed themselves from a very poor country. In the time of the Cultural Revolution, the economic level of China was not better than that of some Sahel zone African nations. Very, very poor. But then, especially because of Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up policy, and this is a long story, but the 40 years since, they have made the biggest economic miracle ever in the history of mankind. They lifted 850 people of their own people out of poverty and, eradicated extreme poverty by the end of, I think it was 2020 or maybe 21. But it's eliminated by an enormous effort to reach out to even the most remote areas in rural areas and think about ways of how every single family could be participating in these programs, e-commerce for farmers, in manufacturing, education, all kinds of ways. And that example has incredibly encouraged the countries of Africa, Latin America, and Asia, that they also can overcome their own poverty. And that is something you cannot reverse. So rather than being completely freaked out about it and trying to suppress it, the countries of the West should reflect on the fact, why did they not develop Africa, Latin America, and Asia with the same kinds of infrastructure projects, building railways, ports, airports, waterways? They could have done that for the entire period after the Second World War, but they didn't. So China is now more popular among these countries because China has something to offer. And, if, you have the choice between either economic development and develop your own resources that you can actually become a middle-level income country in the short to medium term, or just being an attachment to an aircraft carrier for some regional wars and security build-up. And it's clear why these countries of the global south prefer to work with Russia and China, because it's Russia as well, because Russia is offering them a lot of participation, for example, in the development of nuclear energy. So it is very clear why the countries of the global south refuse to be drawn into this conflict, and why they refuse to condemn Russia, because they know this narrative is not true, and it doesn't correspond to their own experience. So it remains the situation, that we have to convince the United States and the European countries to stop their opposition and to cooperate, and then we can find a solution.
Well, Helga, we do have a couple questions on the U.S. political situation, but I think we can postpone those till next week. But I have one I think you'll find interesting. I was speaking at an event the other day, and someone came up to me and he said, I'm so happy to meet someone who knows Lyndon LaRouche. I heard him speak a number of years ago, and I thought, this man's brilliant, but he's too philosophical to understand. And he said, but I'm now happily involved in trying to think that way myself. But how can I inspire other people to take up such profound ideas?
Well, I think that I think the questioner has already the right approach by being a philosophical mind yourself. I mean, if we are living in such a dull environment, where if you compare our present political class with even the people in the post-war period, you had Nehru, you had Sukarno, you had de Gaulle, you had Adenauer, you had Indira Gandhi, and many others. Or even in Germany, if you look at Franz Josef Strauss, Herbert Wehner, Helmut Schmidt. These were people, you may not have liked all of them and not agree with all of them, but they were powerful minds. They would really demand respect, because even if they had different views, they were thinkers, they were intellectuals, they were giants compared to the present crop of politicians. And because of this effort to, Gleichschaltung, to have Gleichschaltung, where all the newspapers are only publishing the official narrative, when you say just something which is not exactly what is the prescribed data line, you get ostracized. Look at what happens at the Frankfurt Books Fair right now this week. They had basically selected a Palestinian writer, a woman, because she had written a book which was discussing the some destiny of a Palestinian who was kidnapped and murdered eventually early on in the 50s or so. So she was supposed to get a prize, and now they kicked her out. She doesn't get the prize. She doesn't get even a room for a discussion, because it supposedly doesn't fit the present situation. Another person was daring, another recipient of a prize, dare to say that the attack by Hamas is disgusting and horrible, but one has to also understand the side of the Palestinians. And he was completely attacked. More down, he doesn't, in this climate, where you have really, it reminds you so much what happened in the 30s, where eventually, Goebbels triumphed, and in the post-war period, British intelligence said that they have to learn to out-Goebbels Goebbels. And I think that's exactly what is happening. And in an environment like that, what is needed is civil courage. If you are a philosophical mind, you can inspire the people around you, because you're not adjusting to this horrible mediocrity. You can attack certain politicians because they're evil, but what's even more stifling is the fact that they are so absolutely horrifyingly mediocre. And in that environment, be a philosophical mind. Do have the courage to discuss great ideas, and discuss the ideas of my late husband, because he was a visionary. He predicted the present collapse of the financial system. He had the vision of how to create a better world, and it is happening right now. Many times I'm thinking, if he would just be alive to see what is happening, because it would be the fulfillment of what his whole life was all about. And he could not live to see it, which I find, in a certain sense, very, very, it fills me with a certain sadness. But, maybe he's somewhere still capable of seeing what is happening. I don't want to make any speculations about that. But, I think be courageous, read the aesthetical letters of Schiller, where at one point, he discusses that question, what do you do when the governments are corrupt and the masses are apathetic. Where should the solution come from? And I think in the 8th or in the 9th letter, Schiller says that Athena, when she came down on earth, she was fully armed. She was, dressed up in armor. And her first sentence was, be courageous to be wise. And I think that's a very good advice. And I think people who have right ideas and are aware of how dangerous the situation right now is, they should have the civil courage to speak out, because too many people say, oh yeah, I agree with you in private, but don't expect me that I speak out, because I will be immediately ostracized by all my friends who all have adjusted to the public narrative. So be wise.
Well, and a good place to start that would be to take the Schiller Institute leaflet on Westphalia, not Versailles, and do a little research, as Helga's been talking about the Westphalian principle, where it came from, what happened to it, and the difference between that and Versailles. That's a good starting point right now, because otherwise we're headed toward a horrible crisis that has no way out internally. You have to get outside of it. So Helga, thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next week.
Yes, one hopes.